Number 1. 4 a.m. fire. I live in an apartment building. I've been here for about 2 years, and my roommate and I have had very few scary experiences so far. Except for this one that happened last summer. It was around 4 in the morning when we were woken from a dead sleep by the fire alarms going off throughout our entire 4-story apartment building. Seeing as this place is occupied mostly by seniors, we figured someone had left a pot on the stove again. I grumbled and blindly grabbed for a blanket. Last time we had a false alarm. I was left shivering and barefoot on the sidewalk waiting for the fire department. And I wasn't about to let that happen again. My roommate and I put on our shoes. I grabbed my phone and keys and we poked our head out into the hallway. Nothing seemed off. The hall was empty. No one else had come out of their apartments yet. Reluctantly, my roommate and I walked down the hall towards the lobby. We figured our neighbors would soon follow suit. It was only when we went through the lobby and out the front door that we realized something was actually wrong. A handful of people who had already come out the building were running and shouting about how the building was actually on fire this time. We followed them around to the side of the building as more and more people fled in their pajamas, and to our horror, we saw an apartment on the top floor belching out flames. People were frantic, searching for water, a ladder, anything. Someone remarked that there was a lady who lived in that apartment who had mobility issues and she needed to be rescued now. And where the hell was the fire department? My roommate was quite disturbed by the whole scene, so we decided to go back to the front of the building, away from the fire. On our way, we saw a guy jump off his balcony to the ground. He rolled when he landed, but I think it still really hurt. Judging from how he sat on the grass and groaned for a while, he was lucky to only be on the second floor. There was chaos, yelling, screaming, and an odd mix of panic and disinterest, especially among the senior citizens who didn't want to leave the building because using the stairs was so difficult. The fire department arrived much quicker than they ever had before, seeing as this was a real emergency, and it wasn't long before elderly ladies in nightgowns were being rescued via ladders and wheeled off to the hospital next door. At one point, the man who lived below the apartment on fire had a screaming episode at one of the landlords, the one that looked like a walking skeleton with an oxygen tank and a scooter. By the time the fire department got everything under control, it was around 6 or 7 a.m. The sun was up and people were beginning their morning commute. The fire department had blocked off our whole street, which must have been a pain, and the entire population of my building sat on the curb in pajamas and blankets. Little kids, old people, broke college kids, the works. The community really pulled together that morning. The public bus service gave us a couple buses to sit and warm up instead of standing around on the chilly sidewalk. Paramedics handed out blankets and assessed injuries. The people in the surrounding houses were kind enough to bring us water and snacks. One lady brought a serving tray with mugs of tea from her own kitchen and offered it to anyone she could find. My mum came down to rescue my roommate and I, even though she lived an hour outside of town and hadn't even showered yet. She brought us breakfast and a change of clothes, as we didn't know when we'd be allowed back into the building. The most disturbing details of what had just taken place that morning came to us as we were waiting on the bus. Everyone was talking about the fire, of course, but one man had a particularly horrifying detail to add. He'd heard through the grapevine that the lady whose apartment caught fire never made it out the building. Sadly, we suspected as much and had mobility issues and all, but there was more. The firefighters apparently found her in the hall. She had made it out of her apartment but couldn't escape the smoke. Whether she died from smoke inhalation or from burns, we aren't sure. But one thing that man said that sticks with me is that someone said that as they stood outside and watched the flames, they heard the woman screaming, "Help me, I'm burning." I've always been afraid of burning to death, and the idea that my neighbor may have had such a horrifying end is deeply disturbing. I know the man who lived below her heard her screaming. He wouldn't stop talking about it. I think he ended up with a form of PTSD from this event, and I don't blame him. We were all brought to a community center where the fire department and emergency response volunteers helped bring some clarity to the situation and told us what to expect. Everyone was very kind and sympathetic to us. Whatever you needed, they provided for us. I think all of that is pretty standard procedure, but still, I was extremely thankful to the kindness of the volunteers, firefighters, paramedics, and good Samaritans. It was pretty surreal to be in a situation like that. We had almost nothing on us. My roommate hadn't thought to grab her phone, so she had to borrow mine to let the family know she was okay. We had no money, no ID, none of the essentials, and we had no idea how long we would be homeless. I hadn't been so happy to have my mum with me in a long time. I felt like a scared little girl, even if I didn't show it. We were lucky. The fire happened on the opposite end of the building from us. Our unit was totally unaffected, and we were one of the few allowed back into our apartment the same day. The building stunk of smoke for weeks. Even though the fire took place on the 4th floor in a single apartment, the damage was extensive. Even on the ground floor, the walls were blackened with ash. When they attempted to start fixing up the building, they found asbestos in the walls. A few people were forced to move out of their apartments. And we're talking about people who have lived there for around 30 years. I remember the night we were allowed back into our apartment. I wanted to box up my most important possessions and keep them in my car, as if I thought the building was going to catch fire again. My home didn't feel safe anymore, and it wouldn't for several weeks. It would take a long time for us to hear anything about what caused the fire. Last I heard, a space heater was to blame, but I don't know for sure. In the days that followed, the fire was featured on the front page of the local paper. The family that lived just down the hall from us were featured in the picture. The article spelled out details that I had already heard. It labelled the guy that lived below the fire as a hero for attempting to save the lady upstairs. It was a valiant effort, but there was nothing he could have done without endangering himself. I feel sorry for him, and I often wonder if the guilt keeps him up at night. Sometimes I think about the lady who passed away in this building. I listen to a lot of ghost stories, so I wonder if a spirit haunts this place. Her sudden and horrifying death would be the sort of thing to make a ghost linger on earth, wouldn't it? So many things left unfinished. Regardless, I hope she's at peace, and I hope that my neighbours have been able to find some semblance of peace as well. 4 months later, we've regained a sense of normalcy. Things are back to how they were before. If you ignore the orange tarps around the side of the exterior, the restoration vans that come and go every day, and the security guards stationed in the lobby, the damaged wing is still closed while they try and sort out the asbestos situation. But for those of us who live on the other end of the building, things are relatively normal. I hope they stay that way. Number 2. The glitch in the matrix in my school. This isn't exactly a horrifying story, so don't get disappointed if you're not terrified. For background, I'm a 15-year-old Irish fella called Ross. I go to school in Ireland. I am now in 3rd year. At the start of 2nd year, I knew a fella who joined the school. I was in charge of showing him around, and we've been good friends ever since. He is Portuguese, and his name is Diego. I call him Tig for this story. His school bag is fairly small, bright red bag. He is a bit shorter than me. His hair is quite short and brown in colour. This will become important momentarily. One day, I was upstairs in my school. It was break time and I was going to my group's usual spot. I turned in corner and saw Tig walking along the hallway. This was weird because at the distance I was from him, I would have seen him come up the stairs. I didn't think much of it at the time. I sped up to catch up to him. There was another corner coming up. He rounded it and I followed suit. Except he wasn't there. There was a staircase going back down and two bathrooms, one for lad and one for lassies, but no Tig. Considering how close I was behind him, he would have had to sprint towards and then jump down the stairs or jog into the bathroom. If he went for the stairs, I would have heard. He must be in the bathroom, I thought. I sat at the bench and waited. Tig was the first other person in our group to arrive. He rounded the corner and left his bag down. The realization hit me hard. He wasn't in the bathroom. I asked him if he had already been up there, to which he answered that he hadn't. He had no reason to lie. Now, I know what you're all thinking. It was someone else. First of all, the person I saw looked the exact same as my friend from the back. Second of all, no one else in the school has that bag, to my knowledge. I haven't seen anyone else with it. That's it. Third, the only place the person could have gone without sprinting down the stairs, which I would probably catch a glimpse of anyway, would be the bathroom. No one came out of the bathroom that I didn't see enter it. Finally, my friend is a fairly distinct character. Not many people have the same body build as him. Like I said at the start, it's not exactly terrifying, but I do believe it to be due to a glitch in the Matrix. Number 3. The doll in the storage room. When I was younger, I'd go visit my grandparents all the time. They lived in a one-floor house with an unfinished basement. I never liked it down there. It felt small for a big basement. There was a little door down there that was for storage, and I always got a horrible feeling when going close to it. And let me add that this was a newer house that was about 6 years old. Now, during the time I was about 6 or 7, I felt so uncomfortable going down there even when I was with someone I didn't like it. I remember going down there with my grandma to help with something. She had to run upstairs because someone rang the doorbell. She said she would be right back, even though she knew how I felt about being alone down there. But I nodded and said, okay. She was gone and I was alone, and I started to get a bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. I didn't move and I didn't want to, even though the lights were on. Now this is where everything started happening, and it still gives me chills. The lights started to flicker and I started to hear noises and what sounded like talking, and it was not coming from upstairs but in the storage room. I heard someone say my name. Here is the part that freaks me out the most. The voice sounded like my grandma. I was confused as hell. How am I hearing her when she is upstairs? I didn't want to move, but me being the curious one I started moving toward the storage room door. The closer I got, the worse the bad feeling came. When I got to the door, the lights turned off in the basement. I wanted to run upstairs and hide. Go home somewhere that wasn't the basement. I heard my name again for the second time. My grandma's voice asking me to open the door to help her, so I did, and I regret it. I couldn't see anything, it was pitch black. I couldn't hear anything but faint laughing that felt like forever, but then the laughing stopped and the lights turned back on in the basement, and I felt a little bit better with the lights back on. But the downside, I could see a little in the storage room. I saw a small clown doll in the storage room, and my grandma hates clowns with a passion and wants nothing to do with them. So why is there a clown down doll? I have no damn idea. Then the lights turned on in the storage room. I saw red that looked like blood all over the place. I screamed and blacked out, and the next thing I knew, I was laying on the couch, my grandma looking at me and asking if I was okay. I have no idea if that was real or a dream, but it sure as hell felt real. If you have any ideas, please let me know. The Ghost Girl and Her Nanny. Hi there. I have so many ghost stories from my past. Well, here is one that will stay with me forever. When I was little, I lived on the grounds of a very old manor house in the UK. The manor itself was used as a college for teaching courses and was fully fitted out to cater for people to stay for week-long courses. There were bedrooms and a fully functioning restaurant as well as the course rooms. My dad actually ran the place. That's why we lived on the grounds. House came with job kinda thing. Anyway, at Christmas, when my grandparents would come and stay, they would stay down at the manor house as we didn't have enough bedrooms at our actual house. And it was only a 5-minute walk away. So one Christmas, my granddad woke up at like 6 a.m. and saw a little girl next to him. At first, he suspected it was me having wandering down to see them. But as he came to move, thinking he needed to get me home before my parents freaked out, he realized the little girl was wearing a bonnet and a long white old-fashioned night dress and looked nothing like me. She smiled at him and touched his head. Then a lady in old-fashioned clothes walked through a wall again, smiling at him, picked up the little girl and walked back through the wall. My grandma slept through the entire thing, and although he said he was never afraid, he knew she would be and would refuse to come for any future visits, so he never told her. He did, however, tell my parents, who had already had many strange occurrences at the manor house, so he knew they would believe him. My dad said the thing that gives this story so much credibility is that the rooms they were staying in used to be the old nursery and the nanny's quarters. My grandparents had no knowledge of this at the time. He said it was all very calm and peaceful and not scary, but somewhat unnerving. So there it is, the first of my many ghost stories. Hope you liked it. Number 2. These are the rules of my house. My father found them in a butter container when we first moved in, and 3 years later, we are all still following them. Important context. I live in the summer house of my family home. It is essentially my bedroom. I love every second of it. Rule number 1. Never leave the house after midnight. If you must, do not make a sound, especially no singing, music, humming, jingling of keys, or talking. Number 2. Never forget to lock up the shed. Maybe open, shut it, and don't look inside. Number 3. Lights will flicker when you turn them off. Do not leave the room until the flickering has stopped. Number 4. If you see a person in the corner of your eye, look at it directly in the eyes and wait until it disappears. Number 5. If you see a man hanging in the living room, leave, shut the door, lock up and go for a walk. He should be gone when you get back. Number 6. Never leave a candle burning, not even for a second while you use the bathroom. If it can burn, it will. Number 7. When you get halfway up the garden, look at the moon. If it's full or waxing, you're safe. Anything else, refer to Rule 8. Number 8. If anything goes wrong, run to the summer house. Lock the door without jingling the keys. They hate that noise. And close all blinds. Put a movie on and watch it its entirety. Number 9. Fall asleep with the video on. It will be switched off at the plug by morning. Ignore this. That means you please them. Number 10. The fridge is never to be turned on nor opened. Either will attract them. Refer to Rule 8 if you can. Number 11. If there is a light on in the house, go inside and turn it off. Refer to Rule 3. Number 12. You will need to drink during the night. Your throat will be scratchy and dry. Only carbonated beverages are to be drank after 12. Number 13. Any open containers will become dangerous after 11 p.m. Ensure all lids are firmly screwed on. Number 14. Moths and spiders will appear around 1 a.m. Catch and release every single one. Do not fall asleep until you do this. Number 15. Take the pills with your name on it. Make sure your name is spelled correctly. If it is not, throw them over your left shoulder. Number 16. You may see graffiti on the sides of the house. The hooded figure drawing it is not friendly, and it must not see you under any circumstances. If it does, climb underneath the storage unit and close your eyes. If you're lucky, it won't remember where you were. Number 17. If you wake up between 2 to 4 a.m., do not open your eyes. Do not open your eyes. If you fell asleep with a night mask on, do not trust it. Number 18. If you feel nauseous, light a candle. If it goes out on its own, go back to sleep. Number 19. If the bin is full, start a new one. If the place is not clean, it will attract them. Number 20. Do not eat anything in this room. It will taste like mold, and it will make you bedridden for upwards of a week, rendering you unable to complete these rules. Number 21. There have been 3 suicides, 2 murders, and 5 deaths in this house, and the previous tenants do not recall ever living here. Document all rules and all sightings and pray the next tenants listen. So these were the rules for the house. A few months ago, I made a mistake. I broke Rule 17. I always set an alarm for 7 a.m. to make sure that I don't open my eyes before then. But this fateful night, I had convinced myself that I simply snoozed my alarm. I opened my eyes. My breath quickly became shallow and laboured. I couldn't breathe. I remember thinking that this is the end. I screwed up. I broke a rule. This is it. My eyes adjusted to the darkness to find a bucket on my chest. It was filled with an off-green coloured fluid, dripping in from somewhere. The dripping slowed nearly to a stop, and my eyes adjusted to a semi-normal level of vision. I glance up at the ceiling, and my eyes become glued to the creature. A mass of dead flies, moths and spiders. The ooze dripping from its protruding hip bone directly into the bucket. It crudely resembles a young child with no facial features but what appears to be a complete skeleton. I blink hard, hoping that this was just another one of those figures you can stare at until they disappear. It was not. It lunged at me and picked up its bucket. I could finally breathe. It picks up an amount of the sludge and applies it like moisturizer on its body, regenerating the areas where its skeleton was unsure. Its legs were stuck to the ceiling, its upper body hanging upside down from the ceiling. I needed to get rid of it. It was toying with me and had regenerative abilities. There's no way I could possibly outsmart it. I shut my eyes as tightly as possible as it replaced its bucket on my chest. And I hear that nauseating dripping noise again. As my chest goes heavier, I somehow fall asleep. I'm not religious, but that day I thanked every god I could think of. I had woken up and I was seemingly unharmed, other than a cracked rib. I told my parents and they smiled. "They must like you," my dad said nonchalantly. I didn't feel lucky. I didn't feel much at all. Of course I was grateful. Anyone would be. But why didn't they kill me? Why did they choose to save me? Am I more valuable alive to them? I don't think I'll ever find out. I'm hoping to move out soon. The previous tenants have been sanctioned under the Mental Health Act recently, apparently suffering from paranoia. They sent us a cease and desist order after we asked them how long they lived here. According to the landlord's bank, all of their checks never existed. There is no evidence they ever were here, even though they left family photos in a box in the attic, and the landlord still has the money. My parents act like this is normal. They don't seem concerned at all. My brother seems unbothered. There's something off with them. I hope my summer house keeps me sane. But I can't help but feel this is the only good way to live. Maybe I should join them in the house. Maybe you should join us too. The house knows best. They know best. Number 3. My grandmother's haunted house. This happened in 2011 when I was 7. I am a girl, now 14, and I just talked to my mother about this incident and decided to share it. So I lived with my grandmother, father, mother, and 2 dogs, quite far from any town. The house was big, so I usually played hide and seek with my mum a lot. I don't remember which month it was, so my mum filled me in on this. She said it was October during the holidays. This one particular day, my dad was out driving my grandma to the hospital as she had an appointment with the doctor. So I was left alone with my mum. After several rounds of hide and seek and watching a movie with my mum, it began to get dark outside, and my dad still wasn't home. I've always been scared of potential home invaders, so I was paranoid all day because my dad wasn't with us. He made me feel very safe. Me and my mum decided to play Monopoly. Fast forward an hour. When I was 7, I thought I was very sly, so I kept stealing money from my mum's stash. Now that I look back, she was probably pretending not to see. As I was taking a $50 bill from my Monopoly cash, she said, "The power will go out soon." This left me completely puzzled, as I had no idea how she'd know this. But sure enough, it went out about 15 minutes later, and I started to panic because, as most little kids, I'm scared of the dark. I later found out that there was a power outage in my area because of a storm, and my mum was notified of it. She handed me this Nokia phone and let me play my favorite game on it, which at the time was Doom. She told me to go hide under the bed sheets if I'm scared, and that she'll be back soon. I asked where she's going, but she didn't answer. As she headed out of the room, she locked the door. I laid under the sheets, killing some monsters on the game for what felt like hours, but was probably only 5 minutes. Footsteps were heard in the kitchen, which was next to the room I was in, so I took the sheets off my head and yelled out, "Mom!" Glad that she's back, because I was really scared, but no answer was heard. The footsteps didn't stop, so I yelled again, "Mom, can you please come? I'm scared." After I had said that, the footsteps stopped completely. I got a sudden rush of adrenaline, so I held tight onto the phone and dashed out the room to the kitchen, which was empty. I was left puzzled, but didn't wait for long as I ran to the door, unlocked it as there's keys on the inside too, and ran to the corridor. Alright, so the corridor has 4 doors. On the right side, one at the very back, which I never was allowed to go in. I later learned that the room was where my great grandma died, and no one touched it ever since. It also had stairs next to it leading to the 2nd floor, and one at the front which led to the outside. The 4th door I came through was the closest to the outside door, so I quickly opened the outside door, ready to run out. But the rush of adrenaline was gone, and I got scared of the outside too. It was very dark, and I was barely able to see. My only choices were go back to the room I came from, or scream for my mum. I chose number 2, and started screaming for mum over and over again. I guess I wasn't loud enough because there were no replies. I remember starting to sweat and panic. Different scenarios playing through my little head. Scenarios like a murderer killing my mum and coming for me next, or my mum leaving me forever. I know, stupid, but I was only 7 after all. I remember looking down at my feet and beginning to cry. More footsteps were heard, but this time behind me. I looked behind me and saw a silhouette of a tall person. I'm assuming it's male due to the body build. At the end of the hallway, standing in front of the door. I can't recall what he looked like because it was all black. I stared at him for about 15 seconds in pure horror. This got my adrenaline pumping again, and I ran out of the door towards the outside toilet, only to be greeted by my mum, who looked worried as hell. After I told her what happened, through uncontrollable sobs, my dad was in the driveway, already parking his car. My granny was left at the hospital for some treatment. He searched the house, but no one was found, so my mum told me it was just my imagination. But I know what I saw and heard. Fast forward 7 more years, I live in another house, and I randomly remembered about this incident and talked to my mum about it. She seemed quite hesitant about telling me this, but at the end I convinced her to tell me. What she said gave me chills. Apparently, when I was 4, I started to stare at one particular corner in the kitchen and laugh like crazy. My mama asked me what's so funny, and every time I point to the same corner, but never told her why it was funny. After a few months, the random giggles I let out when staring at the corner didn't stop. What made my mum lose it was the fact that I started speaking random German words that I've never heard before. We have no relatives that are German or can speak German, and I wasn't introduced to technology at that age either. My mother knew it's German because she can actually speak a little bit, but never spoke it. She bribed me with candy to tell her how I learned to say the following words in Germany: it, help, chocolate, shower, and war. My response completely shocked her. I pointed to the same corner again and said, "He taught me how." My mum kept it cool though. She asked me who I was talking about, and I said, "The man who makes me laugh." My mum asked me what he looked like, but I only said he looks like a shadow and that he is from Germany. When she asked where the man lived, I pointed to the 2nd floor. This all made sense because I always hated the 2nd floor and never went up there because I felt like I was being watched. My parents took it upon themselves to Google the history of the house, and sure enough, it was built by Germans. I don't remember any of this, but my mum kept on reassuring me it happened. My father said he remembers it too, but decided not to tell me until now. I talked to the German man in the corner up until 5 years of age. I'm pretty sure you can put two and two together, but if not, the man I saw when I was 7 was the same man I talked to when I was 4. Every time I go back to visit my grandma, I always feel uneasy. Number 1. The room with the train. I grew up in a small city, the kind of place you could barely call a town, if it wasn't for the sheer number of people living there. Downtown was only a couple of blocks long, and in the middle of it was one of the biggest buildings in the area. It was a local movie theater, named after the city. I remember going there when I was very young, about 7 years old, and watching the first Pokemon movie. It was probably nothing compared to the theaters we have nowadays, but back then, it was huge for me. I loved it. So when a few years later, I heard the cinema was going out of business, I felt really sad about it. The building was sold to a religious group that used it for their services. You know the type: loud music, big crowds with their arms in the air, singing prayers. Some having seizures on the stage while the pastor yells through a mic. Every time I walked past the old cinema, I would see the announcements of the congregation where the movie posters would have been. And if they were in session, you could hear them singing from the other side of the street. The group owned the cinema for nearly a decade, until the local government bought back the building in order to restore it as a historic landmark of the city. When this happened, I was studying construction, with the intent to follow architecture or civil engineering at college, and my class was very lucky to be involved with the cinema's restoration project because two of our teachers were architects working on it. I will always remember the day we went to visit the old cinema. Our class was small, only a handful of students, but we were all about the same age, so we all shared childhood memories of when the cinema was operational. We ran through the corridors of the auditorium, sat in the chairs just like we did when we were little kids, and began stomping on the wooden floor with our feet, filling the entire room with the echoes of our drumming and our laughter. A little ritual of sorts everyone used to do right before the beginning of the movie. Once nostalgia time was over, we went back to the purpose of the trip and began to survey the building. We were very excited because that was a unique opportunity to go into the places we would have never been allowed to otherwise. So we made sure to check every last corner, every single room, no matter how far, no matter how obscure. The first one we found was below the stage. On one of the corners, there was a little door, not very visible, probably because it was meant for maintenance staff only. Behind it, we found a long room filled with rusty boilers, part of the old heating system that was no longer in use. The place was a little creepy, with all of those old tanks and pipes crowding the narrow space, but what we found past them was what really started to freak us out. This room was small, very small. It was, after all, basically just leftover space behind the boilers, yet it contrasted so much with the rest of the area around it. It may as well have been from a different place altogether. The pit walls were painted a light colour, white I think, but I don't remember it very well, because what really got my attention were the drawings in them. There were rainbows, a smiling sun, trees and flowers, and happy little people with smiles on their faces of dotted eyes. It was a daycare. The whole class and teacher gathered to see the discovery. We were all very confused about the strange place of this room. Okay, we couldn't understand the need for a place to keep the kids that were too little to be amongst the crowd during prayers, or maybe the ones of the people who worked there. But the placing was just odd. The stage was probably one of the loudest places in the auditorium during the services, and this was right below it, so there was no way it could be a quiet place for the children. We left the boiler's room and continued our tour through the theatre, a little puzzled about our finding, but not giving it too much thought. Outside of the auditorium, there were these bathrooms, both in terrible condition, the ticket sale booth, and a huge set of stairs that led to a mezzanine in the auditorium. Half of the seats there were totally ruined due to a water leak in the roof, and I cursed these people for not taking proper care of the building. With that part done, all that was left was a projection room. On the third floor, behind the tickets booth, there was a door that led to a spiral stair. I don't remember how tall it actually was, but it must have been over 10 meters of metallic steps without a single resting spot. I wasn't exactly an athlete, but I could walk several kilometers with no problem, and rode on a bike to and from school every single day. Yet by the time I reached the top of the stairs, I was exhausted. And I wasn't the only one. All of my classmates complained about how hard it was to walk up there. After a short break to catch our breath, we moved on to explore the third floor. It was roughly a narrow passageway with a couple of divisions to form different rooms, but it was more than enough for what it was made for. The first room from the stairs was a storage deposit, probably where they kept the movies and other equipment, and except for some trash, it was mostly empty. The second room was the one we were all excited to see, the projector room. The old machine was so big that it was still there, and there were even some pieces scattered around. It was quite a piece of history. We were all very thrilled to check it out, so no one really bothered to move on to the very last room until we were about to leave. And there we saw it again. There was a train in this one instead of a rainbow. Something was written on it in big colourful letters. Something about Christ. I can't remember it well. The drawings were a bit old. The paint slightly peeled from the walls, but the colours were just as cheerful as you would expect for a place where children play. My heart sank to my stomach as I came to the realization of what that place really was. The one behind the boilers probably serving the same purpose. I took notice of how isolated that room was. Literally the furthest away you could possibly get from everyone else. I thought about the 3 floors of stairs and imagined what it would have been like to a child to walk all the way up only to end up in that room, the room with the colourful train in the wall. My classmates and I exchanged horrified expressions, as I knew they were thinking the same. We never visited the theatre again, even though we continued with the restoration project for several months, and we never talked about those 2 rooms. Cases of molestation in the church are well known by everyone, to the point that the pedo priest is practically a cliche. But this is the kind of thing you think happens in some place far away, in another city, even in another country. You would never imagine it can happen in the very same town you live in, the place where you grew up, in the very same building where you once watched a Pokemon movie when you were 7 years old. Number 2. My first sleep paralysis story. I don't remember exactly when this was, I'm pretty sure it was around March of 2018. I was 12 years old and in 7th grade. I often listened to, read scary stories online about things like sleep paralysis, but I never thought it would happen to me. So before I had woken up, I was having a strange dream. I was playing Counter-Strike, but it felt like I wasn't playing and it was real. I was shooting some targets and then I blacked out for a second. I woke up on the main road that goes into my neighborhood and saw that the road was gone. The houses on my street were very small, two-story box houses. There were elderly people standing out front of the houses, all reading a newspaper, and the sign at the front of my neighborhood only read Brook, with the rest crumbling off. I then appeared at my morning bus for school, looking at my phone. Everything was normal until a bush that normally isn't there screwed at me. I remember clearly feeling as though this was normal, so I screamed back. We went back and forth until I woke up with the scream echoing in my ears. I was in my bed looking against the wall, unable to move. I hadn't realized that I was experiencing sleep paralysis, but was still freaked out by that screaming to fall back asleep. I lay there, not hearing anything for about 5 minutes. I then heard what sounded like heavy boots hitting the ground out in my living room, coming towards my bedroom. Just so you know, outside my bedroom there is a hallway. On the left is a bathroom, at the end is my parents' room, and at the end of the right is a door that goes to my living room. The footsteps grew closer, coming to the hallway and then my parents' room. At that moment, I remember my dad was out of town on a business trip, so my mum, who is a nice small lady, was defenseless. I heard the walking start up again and come towards my room. The door opened and whatever was out there came in, walked to the side of my bed and stared at me. I closed my eyes and began to pray. I'm not very religious, but it's the only thing I can think to do. After what felt like hours, I try to turn over to look and see if anyone is there. I roll over with my eyes, still closed to appear to anyone that is there that I'm still asleep. I open my eyes and begin to squint. The coast is clear. I crawl out my bed slowly and look at the clock. 4:14 a.m. Dang, I got school tomorrow, I thought. I tiptoed over to my bedroom. I grabbed a decorative orb my mum put on the wall in my room and walked out into the hall. The light in our living room door was open with light on which was not normal, especially when my dad's out of town. I check the bathroom and peek around the corner of the door. Nobody. So I make a silent sprint into my mum's room, putting the oar down on the floor. I shake her awake, quietly whispering her name. Mama, I think there's someone in the house. I heard walking around outside my room and I began to tear up, realizing this all may have been in my head, and I woke up my mum for nothing. It's alright. We can go check the house real quick. I grab the oar and go check the house with my mother. There was nobody in our house. So I go back to bed, relieved that we were safe and that none of that was real. I haven't had a sleep paralysis experience since, and I'm glad it wasn't worse. This story seems like nothing compared to some of the other stories about it that I've heard. I hope you enjoy reading this. I regret learning what made the whistling in my uncle's house. I wasn't really close to my Uncle Kent. I barely saw him growing up, and we only spoke on birthdays or holidays. I wound up going to college near where he lived, so when my mum proposed staying with him to save on room and board, I was hesitant. Evidently, the arrangement worked out better than expected. Uncle Kent welcomed me with open arms and put me in a huge room overlooking the backyard. He didn't charge rent, cooked all my meals, let me do what I wanted, and even hooked me up with a job. The first few months passed without incident. Then, late one night, while watching one of my shows, I detected the faint aroma of cinnamon. It was strong enough to notice, and lingered for about 2 or 3 minutes. I initially thought nothing of it, until it happened the second time. About 10 days later, I was up late studying when that same cinnamon smell manifested. It was more pungent and had a burst smoky scent this time that seemed to thicken the air to the point where I couldn't even concentrate. I stood up to close a window, and that's when the whistles started. I completely froze. The whistling sent sharp chills down my spine every time there was a fluctuation in its pitch. It sounded muffled and distorted, appearing to come from all directions, as if emanating from the walls. It started out slowly, going through random rhythmic and arrhythmic patterns. It almost sounded like the whistles were trying to form actual words. And this continued for about 10 minutes before finally ceasing. The smoky cinnamon scent lingered a little longer, even after I opened a window. When I told Uncle Kent about it the next morning, he looked more annoyed than surprised or concerned. "It's probably the heating system again," he said in a drab tone. "It's really old and does that every now and then. I'll have it checked if it gets worse." I didn't like the answer, but was satisfied he at least had an explanation. There wasn't really a pattern in how often what I came to know as the cinnamon whistles occurred. I'd usually hear them about once a month. They were always just within earshot and happened at night. Some nights their fluctuating tones and pitches were more melodic. Other times they sounded shrill and high-pitched, like a drill or buzzsaw. I never got used to the whistling. They always gave off this eerie aura and had an organic, almost human-like quality that I found deeply unsettling. I put my foot down one night in mid-February when the cinnamon whistles were so unbearable. I tried sleeping in another room, but realized they permeated throughout the entire house. Since Uncle Kent was so ignorant about it, I took matters into my own hands. One of my co-workers, named Shane, used to repair heating apparatuses and came over to take a look. I brought him down to the basement where he inspected the furnace and parts of its ducts, but gave me a surprisingly positive report. "The furnace itself is old, but in good shape still," Shane said as he put away his tools. "There could be something inside the ducts that's causing the smells and sounds, but I don't have the right gear with me to know for sure." Shane wanted to find the house's outside ventilation exhaust shafts and traced one particular duct that connected to the heating system, but didn't attach to the furnace. While Shane did that, I made sure to leave no trace of him being in the basement, knowing Uncle Kent would be pissed if he saw I had someone look at the heater. While moving some boxes, I spotted an old tape recorder leaning against a vent grill on the floor. I kneeled down and picked the recorder up, noticing it contained a cassette tape which had Georgia 1-9 written across its label. I was going to take the recorder upstairs with me but decided to leave it, in case Uncle Kent had it there for a reason. I planned on mentioning what I found to Shane, but when I stepped outside, he was nowhere to be seen. I circled the house twice, called his phone, and checked the backyard to no avail. It was like he disappeared into thin air. I found myself checking under the back deck, remembering he wanted to see where that other duct led. Way in the back, obscured by a pile of discarded junk, I came upon a narrow vertical opening in the house's side that was wide enough for someone to enter and exit. The entrance was covered by metal fencing under chain and padlock, but seemed to lead roughly around where the actual basement was located. After picking up a whiff of smoky cinnamon that came from the narrow passageway, I was about to investigate further when my phone alerted me that I received a text message. It was from Shane. Gotta run, something came up. Talk later. I tried calling, but Shane didn't answer, so I texted him to meet me in front of the house. However, when I arrived, he was still nowhere to be seen. I called out Shane's name a few times before realizing his car was also gone. Your friend just left. He said to me to tell you something came up, Uncle Kent said as he stepped outside. I just got home, bumped into him on his way out. He actually looked at the furnace, said it was still in good shape, but thinks the whistling and smell is coming from inside the ducts. I awkwardly blurted, thinking he may have kicked Shane out if he told my uncle the reason for his visit. So you're not gonna need a new heater or anything like that to fix this? Uncle Kent just nodded, appearing neither amused nor angry by my remarks. I'll call someone to get it done, he replied flatly before re-entering the house. I never heard back from Shane, thinking he was either angry about my uncle kicking him out, if that happened, or he was in fact dealing with a serious matter. Whatever the case, I figured it'd be best to give him his space and try him the next day. I was awoken by the cinnamon whistles that night around 2:30 a.m., preceded by the scent of burned cinnamon. They sounded particularly intense that night and filled me with a strong sense of dread, lasting about 10 to 15 minutes before abruptly ceasing. Despite every instinct telling me otherwise, I returned to investigate that gated entrance I found on the deck the next day. I cut the padlock with bolt cutters and had to squeeze through the slim corridor which contained that overpowering cinnamon scent. The passage grew wider and led to a steep, narrow staircase that brought me into a windowless concrete room. The smell of burnt cinnamon was overwhelming. The air was heavy, stagnant, and I started perspiring from the sweltering temperature. A single bulb hung from the ceiling that gave off dim flickering light. I first spotted a wooden desk with a small shelf installed directly above it that was linked with black cassette tapes. I focused on the desk and slowly walked towards it before noticing the room's main feature, a metal capsule-shaped enclosure that stood on four legs in the room center. It was placed directly over a circular depression in the floor, which was filled with ashes and charred chunks of wood, presumably a hearth. An intricate network of different sized pipes and tubes protruded from the enclosure's top and funneled into a metal duct that looked exactly like the one Shane was trying to track yesterday. I looked back and forth between the desk and enclosure, unsure which to investigate first. I wound up approaching the desk after noticing a pile of burlap sacks stacked against it with cinnamon written across each one. My eyes were drawn towards the desk's messy surface. There were cassette tapes scattered across it, along with another tape recorder. The cassette tape it held had Ash 1129 written on its tape label. Despite every fiber in my body urging me not to, I pressed the play button. I heard faint static at first, before it played something that made my blood run cold. A symphony of cinnamon whistles rang out, sounding distant but clear enough to distinguish their choppy high-pitched melody. I started trembling as the audio played, but continued scanning the desk until I spotted one particular tape whose label read Shane 216. Despite dreading what I'd hear, I shakily swapped out the tapes as expected. The Shane 216 tape played more cinnamon whistles. What was most disturbing, I immediately recognized them as the same ones I heard last night. My nausea worsened as I sifted through a few other tapes on the shelf, noticing they were all labeled similarly: Willard 31, Daphne 724, Cora 1031, Janice 11:5. They had to be names and dates, I thought, but if that was the case, then Shane's tape was made yesterday. I quickly tried calling his phone, but as it rang, I noticed something written on one of the cassette tapes that almost made me faint. As I processed this horror, I began hearing a set of rhythmic vibrations that coincided with Sean's ring-back tone. I slowly faced the direction it came from, finding myself gazing at one of the room's darkened corners, where I spotted the light blue glow of a flashing phone screen. "Shane," I whispered, as my phone slipped from my sweaty, trembling hand. I stood anchored in place as the glowing phone screen moved towards me, accompanied by the sound of slow, heavy footsteps. My stomach sank. Someone else was here, I thought. That was Shane's phone, but that wasn't Shane. The approaching figure was definitely taller. The person was shirtless. Their arms and torso were coated in what looked like grey and red paint, which glistened in the room's dim flickering light. The individual wore dark cargo pants and had two curved horns protruding from their head, along with a long snout-like nose that was a lot stiffer than the rest of its body. It was a mask, I quickly realized. Either a mask, or by the looks of it, the actual head of a cow or bull. Who's there?" I weakly mumbled, stepping back against the desk, while my eyes widened with horror as the bull-headed figure paused right at the light's edge. After releasing a deep exhale, it walked up to the metal enclosure and opened a square hatch. I was hit with a fresh wave of that burnt cinnamon aroma, which had something gamey mixed with it that reminded me of overcooked beef. It reached inside the hollow enclosure, completely submerging its head and upper body, which was when I took my chance to run. Before racing up the staircase, I looked back once more to see the bull-headed figure now facing me, holding a human skull in one of its hands that it pulled from the enclosure. I squeezed through the passageway in seconds, screaming frantically as I burst out from under the deck, ran to the front yard, and collapsed in a heap against my car. I wasn't going back inside the house, and I didn't know what to do next. Call Uncle Kent? The police? Or just get somewhere safe? I went into the latter option, got in my car and called for help at a neighbor's house. I still can't fathom what the police uncovered. The metal enclosure was apparently made of bronze and seemed to function as an oven or furnace. Investigators found human remains inside the enclosure, mostly bones, coming from at least 8 different individuals, including Shane, but thought the body count was higher. They believed my uncle, or whoever else it was, brought people into the chamber, got them inside that bronze enclosure, lit a fire under it, and literally cooked them alive. Investigators concluded this after finding the enclosure's inner walls were littered with scratch marks. The cinnamon was thrown into masked the smell of burning flesh. But what bothered me most was how that assortment of pipes and tubing on top of the enclosure functioned. Those pipes converted the acoustics of screams of people burning inside the enclosure to make them sound like whistling. Every time I smelled burnt cinnamon and heard that ghastly whistling, it was actually someone's agonizing shrieks while they were roasted alive. Uncle Kent vanished that same day and was never found. Looking back at how nonchalant he always was whenever I mentioned the cinnamon whistles, it made me wonder what he truly knew. Was he trying to cover up his own doing, or protect me from who or whatever lurked beneath his house? Was the bull-headed figure I saw actually my uncle, or someone entirely different? Both or outcomes were equally terrifying. The police found 15 cassette tapes, as I suspected. Each one was labeled with someone's name and a date, which actually helped investigators identify some of the victims. The tapes were a collection of every victim's recorded screams or whistles, which I realized probably explained that old tape recorder I found in the basement. There's one particular tape whose memory still induces a sense of paralyzing fear. I spotted it while trying to call Shane, right before I heard his phone vibrating. The cassette tape in question had my name written on it, along with a date of 2/18.